Hello and welcome to episode number 453 of the Armin Show podcast. Science, people, creativity, learning more, expanding our framework, interesting, knowledgeable individuals. That's what the world is about, according to a perspective that I like to take. On our episode today, we have a wonderful guest that reviews interesting material, researches it, and has some super skills as well. I would like to bring forth my guest today, Dr. Melissa A. Ilardo. Melissa, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Great to be here.
I'm glad to have you on. You're at the University of Utah. You do research, and you also, I have to start with this because it's so interesting, speak no shortage of languages. How does one build up, before we get into the material that you research, all that language-based ability?
I was lucky to start learning languages when I was quite young. So I went to a school that taught French and Spanish from, kindergarten. And so I had a lot of exposure. And then the rest kind of came situationally. So, I learned Japanese in high school. I learned Italian in college because I have Italian heritage and wanted to learn that language. Learned Indonesian for my research, learned Danish living in Denmark, and so on and so on.
Does knowing, because language learning has been mentioned over the years as so valuable, does knowing all these various languages affect how you have come through the world? Or is it just a nice thing there, but not a big effect?
I think it makes a huge difference. I really felt this the most when I learned Indonesian. Before starting my research with Indonesian divers, I spoke with an anthropologist who said, if you want to do this work, you have to learn Indonesian. And so I took that very seriously, and I, did a lot of self-study and enrolled in classes and things like that. And it really fundamentally changed how I interacted with the population that I worked with. I think being able to speak to people directly in their own language makes a huge difference. And I think it's really important, not just for the community outreach, that's a big part of the project, but really understanding the culture in a way that actually makes the science better too.
There's something special about speaking to people in their language when you're with them, working with them. It's like you're at home it's like a home versus a house. And so a house doesn't have that same sense of, oh, okay, we can all be at peace and cortisol levels are down. But when there's a home, we're all interconnected and let's see what we can do that's great. And language is a big part of that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I
Sometimes
think,
people,
for example, also in Korea, it gave us a huge clue as to some genetics results that eventually came up when we did the study. So I was working in a place called Jeju Island, and Jeju Island is part of Korea, part of South Korea. And yet when you go there, if you speak even a little bit of Korean, you can hear that the Korean that they're speaking is quite different. So much so that it's often actually categorized as a different language entirely. And so in that way, it really got us thinking about how that might be reflected in the genetics of that population. So again, it was really amazing to be able to connect with the population by speaking some of their language, but it also informed our research.
how cool is that? Genetics is mentioned here. Genetics is a category you look at in detail along with other items. What made you look into the categories that you have gone to research over the years? What led you in that direction?
I've always been interested in evolution. That's something that kind of, a thread that wove its way through my career. When I heard about some of these breath hold diving populations, it just really struck me as an opportunity for studying evolution. Because, when you hear about what these populations are capable of, or even if you have the privilege to see them do this diving in real life, you can tell immediately that there's something special about that population. And so the combination of my underlying interest in evolution as this just incredible force of nature and hearing about and witnessing these divers made me really curious to look into how we could actually kind of scientifically quantify essentially just how special they are.
You looked at groups of people, populations, and analyzed, okay, what is something that they have developed over time that gives them a difference from others, and how did that develop? why, and then what can other people take from that. So that's something you've looked at.
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
This is a wonderful thing. Now, breath holding is a big category that has been looked at for divers. How long they can hold their breath, the ability to hold their breath, and then adaptations that come from that. Can you tell us about that category?
Yeah, so there's, within breath hold diving, there's actually a sport of breath holding and breath hold diving. So competitive breath hold divers. And these people do absolutely incredible things with their bodies. And then there's also these traditional, often indigenous breath hold divers who are diving really functionally. And so, no matter what your background, when you dive, initiate something called the mammalian dive reflex. And what happens is the combination of holding your breath and being submerged in water triggers a reflex that all mammals have. So, scientists have actually taught mice to dive, and the same thing happens in mice. So, all mammals have this reflex where our heart rate slows down, our blood vessels constrict in the periphery, and these are both oxygen conserving mechanisms. Slower heart rate means that the oxygen is moving through your body more slowly. The movement of the blood towards the center of your body keeps it where it's needed the most. And then you also have this third component, which is contraction of the spleen. And so the spleen is this bizarre organ that you can live without, but it's a reservoir for oxygenated red blood cells. And as you dive, that contraction pushes those red blood cells into circulation, increasing the amount of oxygen that's available to you. So that's kind of the physiological response that we see across divers. And, with fairly minimal training, you can actually train yourself to hold your breath for quite a long time. But the question is, when you're doing this repeatedly over thousands of years, how can a population survive and thrive with that being their predominant activity for collecting food?
It's true. Is there now the first thing that comes to mind when there's a give, there's a take? As this develops, is it taking into account that something else can undevelop, or is it a complete benefit? What comes to mind in that category?
Yeah, so when we think about one of the populations that I worked with, the Bajo in Indonesia, and in various contexts, different parts of Southeast Asia, they're called Bajau or Samalau. There's all different names for that population, but in Indonesia, they call themselves Bajo. So I'm going to use that word. But the Bajo have this adaptation that actually makes their spleens larger. And so the benefit of this is this increase in available oxygen. So it's like they're carrying around, if you think of the spleen as a biological scuba tank, they're carrying around a bigger tank. So in theory, that should be able to make them, hold their breath more safely and for longer. And so, that seems like a unilaterally beneficial thing. But we actually found through the genetic research that we did that this increase in spleen size is coming from an increase in thyroid hormone levels. So they're not at the point where they're, clinically hyperthyroid. That's kind of a, pathogenic state. But they have higher than average thyroid hormone levels. So you could imagine that, we're kind of finely tuned in terms of levels of things like thyroid hormones. So maybe having these slightly higher levels are in some way, harming them in a way that we don't yet know.
When you're analyzing a population, what does the day-to-day field work look like? What are you checking on, and how are they participating?
So we always start with an extensive community outreach phase. So we go to the community, we say, hey, here's what we do in the lab. Here's what we've done with other populations. Is this something you're interested in? How would you feel about this? What kind of questions do you have about your own population, and how can we help you answer those? And if there's community support, then we proceed with designing the experiments. In some communities, maybe they're really sensitive to blood. They don't want to have their blood taken. And so we don't draw blood. Everything is very iterative, and we're constantly communicating with the population to make sure that the project is something that they feel benefits them. Then once we actually have decided on a project and gotten approvals from various organizations to do the project, we go out in the community and we, conduct these physiological measurements. So, In the case of the Bajo, what we did was we measured, I actually brought a portable ultrasound machine and measured their spleen size. So I was going around the community to different homes, and people would come in and have their spleen size measured. And then we asked them to spit in a tube, and that was how we got their DNA. In the Hanyo project that we did in Korea, so on this island of Jeju, where it's all women divers, we actually did something called simulated dives. So this is where you can simulate the same response that you get when you dive by putting your face in a bowl full of cold water as you hold your breath. And so we did simulated dives so that we were able to measure the physiology of their dive response in a lab setting. So that looked a little different. We would have people come to us instead of going to them. We would explain the setup. We'd often demonstrate the setup. What does it look like to dive in this way? And they thought it was pretty ridiculous, but they still were willing to participate. And in that case, the Henyo were okay with us taking blood samples. So we took blood samples as well. So it really depends on the community, the goals in terms of what physiology we're trying to measure. But yeah, that's how the collection process works. And then at the end of it, my favorite part is we go back to the community and we say, hey, here's what we found. What do you think? And so that's always a really fun conversation as well.
That would be my favorite part as well, because I was thinking about that afterwards. Hey, everybody, look, this is you guys in terms of data and what we have, and they're the it from the research. That's a very interesting one. So that's my spleen, So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, people get really excited about the size of their spleen. They get a little competitive sometimes. Like, hey, my spleen's bigger than yours.
Right. Comparative spleen work. That's quite cool. And then the community, you feel like you're part of. That's something nice when you're part of something, wherever it is. Like, oh, some research is being done way over there. It's kind of a neat feature right there.
Mm-hmm. And it gives the community an opportunity to provide feedback on how we present the results. Because sometimes in the past, researchers have presented results without ever consulting the community. And the community then says, hey, we didn't sign up for this. This wasn't what we thought this study was about. This wasn't what we thought you were going to share with the world about us. It's really their story and their data. So it's really important to us that they have a role in telling that story. And that very much dictates how we share the results.
It's a big part of warmth in a way when everybody is brought forth that they're part of something, then versus it's like if I was analyzing some ants here, but they didn't know, but they're ants, but they would, if they were thinking about people and trying to connect, they would think, darn, we were just looked at and examined, but we were not. You could have said, hey, hello there, and we're looking at this, or your strength, you can lift 10 times what you weigh. It would feel more like you're a part of something, which brings everybody together, and then everybody does better when they feel like they're together.
Exactly, yeah.
It's an important detail. I think that's happening more over time, that people are, both sides of the research are seeing each other in some way.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I think, in part because of the mistakes that have been made in the past, there's a lot more push for that kind of interaction with communities, which is really how it should have been done the whole time anyway.
We noticed that in different facets of life, the disconnection, at first it was something that was more efficient, or we'll just get it done and it's not important on the other end, or maybe with the consumption creation and then the waste products are somewhere else, and it'll work itself out, but then it boomerangs back, and then now you're left alone. You can't really leave out a thing forever, is I guess the concept there. So that's an important detail. The spleen. Is there any other organs that are relevant, such as the spleen, in this type of analysis?
Yeah, so we actually found in the Henyo divers in Korea, the all-female divers, that adaptation in that population has actually acted on their blood vessels. And so we think that the adaptation that we're seeing in that population actually protects them from the risks of that vasoconstriction that I mentioned during pregnancy. So these women dive throughout their pregnancy. Many of them told me they dove up to the day they gave birth. And when that vasoconstriction, the constriction of your blood vessels happens, there's only so much space for that blood to go. And so it increases your blood pressure. And this is something we can measure quite easily. That's helpful if you're diving, but if you're diving and you're pregnant, that can actually be quite harmful to have that constant increase, repeated increase in your blood pressure. So they've actually evolved an adaptation that acts on the blood vessels themselves to make that safer, we think.
One interesting thing, the blood vessels as well that's a different category. But one interesting thing that comes to mind is it's like we look at and we find, like with the cold water, and we put our face in it, and it speaks to something that was already set up for, like, if you're falling in the ocean, for example, and then it kicks systems into gear. Are we taking advantage of things that were already there? Are they more like extreme circumstances that are supposed to be touched very rarely? Or are these things that are available, but we just don't get to them? And sometimes with modern life, we really don't get to them.
Yeah, I think it's more likely the latter because evolution is extremely slow. So that's why, it previously wasn't even thought that evolution could happen as quickly as we see in some of these human populations. And part of the reason for that is if you're waiting for a mutation to come up that gives you some kind of advantage, often it has to be many mutations, and most mutations that happen don't even make it into the population because they're lethal before an embryo is even formed. So waiting for this like perfect mutation that's going to give you a better shot at diving takes forever. And that's why, evolution happens over, hundreds of thousands to millions of years because it's very slow. But when you already have something in the population, like the dive reflex, then people who have this kind of existing variation that maybe makes them slightly better at it, or changes their response slightly, that can increase in frequency much more quickly because it's already there. So then you just need for the people who have that variation to survive and pass it on to their offspring, and the people who don't to either, not survive or not pass it on as much.
It's nice that we have these examples where we can see something in place, because it makes it easier to get inspired when there's a link to, oh, look, a change over time slowly, or with the flies that they did with, or the plants with Mendel. Anything you see, the actual adjustments very quickly, you're like, oh, okay. Normally we would need tens of thousands of years or such, but here there's something. Oh, okay. Then we can extrapolate to other things that have happened. It helps us link to that, versus if we never saw anything ever, it would be disturbing a little bit. Like, we just have to use some sort of simulation, I guess.
Yeah. And actually, interestingly, in the history of our species, we have stolen adaptive genetic variation. A really cool example of that is Tibetans who have adapted to altitude. The genes that actually make them better suited to surviving at altitude were kind of stolen from this ancestral hominid called the Denisovan. So this was kind of around the same time as Neanderthals. You had humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans, maybe some other human-like species on the planet who are close enough, similar enough that they could intermix and produce offspring. And so that happened sometime in the past, somewhere in the region of Tibet. And there was genetic variation from this other, human-like species that was beneficial at altitude. And so the human genome kind of stole that and used that to its advantage. So it's a really cool process called adaptive introgression.
It's very neat that as we get more detail on each part, we can work backwards and say, okay, this was brought forth here because of this. We added this feature because of this. And you can almost reverse engineer how we got all our pieces that make us adapted to the framework that we are in currently. So
Exactly, yeah.
It's like the story is sort of already there, and we have to work backwards on it in some ways. Interesting one. Various populations. So Indonesia. So what are examples of different populations? You have brought up two. What are some various populations, and what is there any common features among these populations that gives them some variation among the public?
in terms of adapted populations, we know of multiple high altitude populations. So in Tibet, in the highlands of Ethiopia, and in the Andes, different populations who have lived at these really high altitudes for thousands of years have actually evolved to better tolerate living at altitude. And that's because, at altitude, the partial pressure of oxygen is lower, and so your body responds in various ways that create physiological challenges. It's interesting given the fact that like the driving force there is hypoxia. Hypoxia or low oxygen is also the driving force of adaptation in diving populations. But it's a very different kind of hypoxia. So at altitude, we call it chronic hypoxia. So just 24 hours a day, you're experiencing lower levels of oxygen. Whereas in divers, it's acute hypoxia. So when they're diving, they're holding their breath and they're getting no fresh oxygen in, except for the air that's still in their lungs. And so, we haven't yet found overlapping signals between those two populations, but it's exciting as we start to work with other diving populations around the world, because maybe we will start to see genes in common, where genes that protect high altitude populations may also protect diving populations.
There's shared points there. One thing you brought up there made me think of something I should mention more often, but I always think about it: chronic conditions versus acute conditions. I have a theme in life that chronic conditions are the ones that really have an effect on a person, because sometimes if you look at a 10-year period of a lifetime, the brief things that people are so concerned about, a shocking, like punctuated equilibrium moments, are not usually the things that have the most effect on a life. Sometimes they are, but usually I've noticed the things that have an effect on a life are slow, right there, no surprise, and happen 18,000 times. And then, oh, there's some damage somewhere or a change or whatnot. So I think of that as a funny concept, how people think that, oh no, I'm concerned about this shocking thing happening, but more likely the thing they're doing 55 days in a row is the actual effector on their being.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of how evolution works. It has to be a pressure that's continuous for a very long time, again, because it's a slow process. And so you need that pressure to continue through time. You could call evolution a chronic condition.
That's actually a good point. Just that specific detail, having key terms to describe things, clarity. That's one of the most important things now. Actually, I always take things to I extrapolate them in some way. But in 2025, having clarity of thought or ability to do deep work is such a separator compared to 20 years ago, because now we have all the tools and resources and whatnot more so than ever. But clarity and making terms clear, and this is a that, and we're looking at that, it's so valuable. Whereas long ago, it wasn't. I mean, one by one, we'll figure things out. But now the other things are taken care of. And so having like this is this and this is so valuable.
And I think
And
that's one area where I personally feel that the academic research community has kind of failed the public in terms of communicating ideas clearly and concisely and in a way that's easy to understand. Because I think there's been so much focus, and this is largely driven by the structure of academic institutions. It's all about publishing, speaking at conferences, getting your work out to the scientific community. But to me, it's equally important. Taxpayers are paying for most of the research that we're doing. So of course, it's important that we communicate what we're doing and why in a way that's clear for the people who are paying for it. And so I think that's important for building trust between researchers and the public. I think it's important for understanding why we're doing what we're doing and what value it brings. And I think that's something that I strive to do better all the time.
highly valuable. And it's such a minority, I would say, that's bringing clarity and a lot of usage of we'll call it prefrontal cortex, or thinking, or critical thinking, or putting things together. It's so short, in such short amount in the current moment. So anytime it shows up, you're like, oh wow, it's like gold. You're like seeing gold randomly. Oh, I found it. Let's go and look at this gold mine. It's very interesting out here. That's funny.
I mean, I also just think that science is really cool personally. So I feel like it's important to communicate it in a way that other people feel that too.
I should suddenly switch the whole theme of the show. So we are not a fan of science here. We don't like learning and putting things together. We are completely flipped. I'm joking. No, that is true. It's something very nice about it, and it builds upon it. I really like things that build upon themselves because then the base of what was there. I like things where the next day is affected by the previous day. So the things that build upon one another, they go like this. But if there's no building and it's just you're just putting out a thought that comes to mind with no critical thinking every day, it could just restart every day. We're not getting anywhere. And I relate this to like even being in an audience versus on the stage. The person on the stage is changing their life, performing. It's a big thing. The person in the audience, you could replace them with somebody else and it wouldn't change the thing at all. So it's nice to be on that stage and then also using your faculties while you have them. I think it's a nice feature.
Mm-hmm.
I always take things more broadly, but that's my nature of things. They're like, wait a minute, how is this related to the spleen? But there's a connection. There's a connection there. That's funny. Extreme adaptations. You look at some extreme adaptations, and then how can these relate to everyday medicine? I've had a variety of also, doctors and such on the program, and how does this connect to any potential medicines, or is this life habits that people develop? How do those connect?
Yeah, so we find both, genetic and physiological adaptations. So physiological adaptations are those that you can train. So that's kind of a directly relevant, like what we saw in the divers in Korea is that they have this effect where their resting heart rate is lower because they dive. And so, that's something that you can do just by training. But the genetic adaptations that we identify, we hope can go on to inspire therapeutics. So another example from Korea is that this adaptation that we found that we think protects them as they're diving through pregnancy also may protect the whole population from stroke. So Jeju Island has the highest rate of hypertension in all of Korea, but the lowest stroke mortality. And normally those things correlate quite tightly. But we're seeing that even if we account for, all known factors like sodium consumption, age, alcohol, smoking, things like that, we can't explain this difference by anything other than being from Jeju, which suggests that it could be genetic. And so what this tells us is if we can understand that and understand that relationship and how this is protecting them, then we can use that to develop a therapeutic that could be applied in anyone. So, if we mimic this evolutionarily adapted feature as a medicine, then we hope that we can help people all over the world.
That's a substantial deal right there. Hypertension and stroke are often, very correlated because then now extra pressure, boom, likelihood of too much, and then that would be substantial. And then this is like a extended layer, but it's still relevant. Sometimes if we do figure out a way to, when we map out all the pieces and we take care of this item and this item, are we setting up a future larger thing at times, or is that not the case?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly hope so. So this is hopefully just a first step in terms of that process.
Right. Like, is it sometimes? Oh, but the thing I'm trying to describe is there sometimes that if we tackle, let's say, hypertension leading to stroke, and then we find a way to put a cap on the hypertension in some way or respond to it with the adaptation, can that lead to something? I guess not. No, that's the main thing. It would be the pressure. So in this case, maybe not so. But is it the case sometimes that, let's say there's 4 items that lead to something, and we find a way that takes care of this thing and takes care of this thing and takes care of this thing, but not something, I guess, underneath all of them, that now this one will blow up more than it normally would? It's kind of a stretch question, but
No, yeah, it's an interesting question. And certainly often we fix one thing only to break something else. So, like an example of that is Ozempic, which has had huge benefits for people around the world. It also seems to cause a loss of muscle. So, that's a really, sarcopenia, or muscle loss of muscle function is a huge problem already for aging adults, for, all different categories of people. And so if you're taking this drug that's supposed to help you, and then you're developing this loss of muscle that can actually harm you in the long run. And certainly in terms of the mechanistic, if we fix one component of a mechanism, how does that affect everything else? This is why it's very expensive to develop drugs, because you have to figure all of those things out. So it's all very complicated. Biology does not make things easy for us. But I think that, we're focused on that first part and saying, the inspiration for these therapeutics has to come from somewhere. And mostly so far, it has come from a focus on disease. So instead of focusing on people who are protected from stroke, most of this kind of work has focused on people who get stroke. And so we leave out this whole area of this whole end of the spectrum in terms of human health, where we have, disease on one side, wellness and resilience on the other side. And by focusing on disease, it's led us to all kinds of incredible, insights and discoveries. But then there's this whole other part of the spectrum that we're ignoring. And so we're just kind of saying, hey, let's look over here and see what we can find.
The heart rate that people have, like beats per minute, do you notice any relations to that and the diving crew or other categories? And how does that relate to their general well-being?
Yeah, so in general, it's considered that, low resting heart rate, obviously to, a certain degree, is beneficial to your overall health. And what we see in the Haenyeo divers in Korea, as well as in competitive breath hold divers all over the world from every ethnic background, is that the practice of diving regularly, so training as a diver, and we don't know exactly, what frequency that has to be, but lowers your resting heart rate. And so one could assume that that means that, the practice of breath hold diving is giving you this cardiovascular benefit. In terms of studies that have been conducted to that effect, if you take people who have never been diving before and train them as divers, how does that benefit them? Those studies haven't been done, but it's reasonable to assume that it would be helpful in terms of your overall cardiovascular health.
When it comes to mind about divers, the big difference, I guess, than normal swimmer or something is the smash into the water, and then that affects that. It's a big difference. Sometimes they go up very high, and then I'm sure they have to build up certain resilience to handle that pressure or falling, and then
Yeah, especially with the really deep divers, there's just an enormous amount of pressure, on their bodies in terms of compressing their lungs, their rib cage, all of these things. As they're diving, people are diving to absolutely ridiculous depths that I could never imagine. Some of these competitive breath hold divers, if you have time and you're bored, look up the statistics, because it's just like unreal that people can do that with their bodies.
That's one nice thing about how many people we have on Earth. There's some super extremes in each category, and you see it and you're like, oh, okay, this is different. This is very different from my.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a cool part.
Absolutely.
Now, how is diving? Well, no, how are adaptations that are happening shaping biology, or how do we look at what you're looking at and then take that to other categories? Is there any way to look at? Oh, okay, we noticed these things. Does it help to know who to look for other features?
Yeah, so there's lots of other populations on Earth that are doing incredible things. And so I think, what we're learning from the work that I've done with the divers so far is that humans are much more, evolutionarily flexible than we previously thought. And so it's worth taking another look at some of these other populations that have been, a lot of times populations that do extreme things are dismissed as like, oh, it's just a training effect. Oh, it's just, they just, like in cold environments, they just wear a lot of clothes or something like that. But it's like, well, maybe there is something actually still unique going on in that population. And then another, kind of approach that this inspires also, though, is looking at comparative evolutionary genetics. And so this is something, that other people are doing in really interesting ways, but saying like, okay, what if we look at these extreme humans and compare them to extreme seals, not like Navy SEALs, but like seals in the water, seals, who can also hold their breath for a really long time, and look for kind of overlapping evolutionary signals there. So that's also another really exciting direction for this work.
That's an interesting one here. Now, this one is specific to type of research. Is there a specific like ultrasound genotype phenotype coupling? Is there any sort of great instrument or method that affected your research?
Yeah, I mean, I'm so fortunate. My research is so interdisciplinary that I rely heavily on the expertise of others, and the knowledge of others in so many ways, whether it's anthropologists, physiologists, geneticists. And so, in terms of I couldn't do the work that I do without the anthropological foundation that others have laid over many, many years, in terms of understanding these populations and their histories, and, like working with the communities themselves. Then also, in terms of physiology, ultrasound was huge in terms of the work that we did. I also partnered with an incredible exercise physiology lab in Copenhagen, that helps me develop the simulated diving protocols and help figure out, what exactly we should be measuring and how. So there's a lot of technologies involved in that in terms of continuously monitoring blood pressure and heart rate, and how do we do this while someone's laying on their stomach and putting their face in water. We're working on ways to modify that even further to collect more data. And then in terms of computational genetics, technologies or methodologies that have been beneficial and essential to this work, in both of the studies that I did with divers, we used a particular method that was actually developed by my postdoc supervisor's lab, that is extraordinary for detecting evolution in populations that may have mixed with other populations. So that's something we call admixture. So it's like, if you have heritage from different groups, you are an admixed individual. And sometimes that can really complicate genetic analyses. And so this extraordinary method that my postdoc supervisor, Rasmus Nielsen, and his group developed enables us to identify evolution even in populations like that. So yeah, I mean, at every step, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, I would say, in terms of pretty much every analysis and measurement that I take.
That is cool. How much of DNA can we currently look at to compare people's DNA and then match sections to say, okay, they have the exact same gene? How much can we look at right now as far as what, like percent of detail or such?
Um, It's hard to give a percent exactly. So there's this interesting thing happening where, we do something called whole genome sequencing. So that suggests it's the whole genome, which is true. We are sequencing the whole genome, but we then match it to a reference genome. And our reference genomes, up until recently, have been somewhat incomplete. And part of the reason for that is that there are multiple kinds of variation in the genome. So one kind of variation is called single nucleotide variation. So this is just, when you the letters of like Gattaca, the letters of DNA, if you change one of those letters somewhere in your genome, there's 3.5 billion letters in your genome, and changing just one of them can have huge consequences in terms of your physiology. And so that's mostly what we've been looking at so far. But then there's also this kind of variation that changes huge chunks of your genome. And this is something called structural variation. And we're just really starting to kind of learn more about this, because structural variation is really hard to capture with existing DNA sequencing technologies. And it's really hard to represent in terms of a reference. So our current reference genome, that is used for most of these kinds of studies, doesn't really contain much in terms of structural variation. However, there's some new efforts to fix that, using something called graph-based genomes. And so these are genomes that are trying to reference genomes that are trying to represent that complexity in a way that will enable us to capture more of what makes every individual and every population unique.
Are people's sequences that they might be putting into some online platform or some public database, are they able to be compared with AI and then, or some sort of analysis tool, and then okay, these are the like is everybody's details being analyzed right now so we can see the differences, and these 45 people match here and these 30 people match here, but this is the difference here.
Yeah, that can be done. Most of these, like 23andMe and Ancestry kind of uh, tech or companies, what they do is something called a SNP chip. So this is where they say, okay, the 500,000 most informative sites in the genome are these 500,000. So we're just going to look at those. So they're not looking across the whole genome; they're just looking at a selection. And these are the ones that influence things like hair color and eye color and earwax quality or whatever it is that you get back on that report that you get from them. And so those can be compared between individuals, but it's a very different kind of comparison than what we can do with whole genome sequencing data.
Interesting one here. You mentioned earwax. For diving, it makes me think of that when I would go in some depth of water, but the effect on the ears, is there any details on that that are interesting of like how people handled that? Because it could almost like knock out your hearing. It would seem like when you smash into the water.
Yeah, that's pretty much exactly what happens. So sometimes they will actually divers will intentionally rupture their eardrums so that they don't have to, because otherwise you have to equalize, every, however many feet as you descend in the water. So you have to plug your nose and, pop your ears a little bit to relieve that pressure that's building up. And in order to not have to do that, some divers are known to rupture their eardrums, by not equalizing and just diving. And then it makes it easier in a way. But because of that, they tend to speak very loudly because their hearing is very much affected.
That's one of those extreme life changes that puts people in an extreme category of sorts. And I think, is that undoable, or that once that's done, that's already
I think once it's done, it's done. I'm not sure. It depends. Maybe it depends on the damage that you've done to the ear.
right? How interesting. That is right. It's almost like, yeah, when the swimmer has a certain leg adaptation and you just can't compete because you don't have the same kind of bend, or different athletes, and we call that talent. And there's the details that make people, there's like already built in details, and then there's one you can add in life with some method like that that puts you in a separate category. And then there's that give and take kind of going on there.
Mm-hmm.
What is looking into the next few years? What are items you would like to explore more based on what you have already explored?
Yeah, I definitely want to. We're really interested in digging into this potential protection from stroke in Korea, and so to really, solidify that connection, there's a lot of other tests and data that we need to perform and collect. And so that's definitely a direction we want to pursue because we're really excited about this possibility that maybe what we learn from that population could inspire therapeutics. But also, there are populations all over the world that I'm interested in connecting with and working with, if they are interested as well. And so I'm, pursuing in the early stages of some of those, getting started with some of those populations, which is a really exciting time because it's mostly just, talking to communities about what's of interest to them, and pursuing some of those directions.
And then, who are some figures that have inspired you? Are there any one or two main figures that academics or researchers or other people that you look to and you said, all right, that's like a fork in the road and maybe led towards the path you're currently on?
Yeah, I mean, I can think of two right off the bat in very different ways. So when I was in high school, I was lucky enough to get to go to the Galapagos I went to a science and math high school. And so I went with an evolutionary biologist, which was extraordinary. And hearing about, the combination of the researcher slash instructor who I went with, but also hearing about Darwin and his experience in the Galapagos, was really inspiring and planted this seed, I think, for me, this lifelong interest in evolution. But then another really important fork in the road for me was when I was between my master's and my PhD. I wasn't 100% sure what I wanted to do next. And I was reading about, different research happening around the world. And I came across a New York Times article about a professor in Denmark who had recently returned the remains of a Native American boy to the community who from whom those remains were taken. So it was like a big hit to the science because they, they returned all of the remains. They stopped conducting any ancient DNA research, anything like that. But he felt that it was really important to respect the wishes of the community, and they returned the remains and performed a reburial. And I thought that's the kind of scientist I want to be. And so that's who ended up being my PhD supervisor.
That's something nice when there's a warm feeling. You're like, wait a minute, I see a nice sign there, and then you reach toward that. That's a big deal. When you that linkage is very nice when that happens in life, and you should follow it, and you did follow it. So there,
I
that's
did,
a neat
yeah.
one.
I had
Yeah, it's
to
very neat.
basically harass him into it, but it was.
I am here. We are doing research. We must do this. Okay, okay, that's funny. That's wonderful. Yeah, we have to connect with. I've talked about it a few times when there's something that matches you, or there is a warmth that you sense, or it speaks to you in the right way. You really should go for that, because how many other people, maybe nobody had that same feeling directly towards that person or their work. And if you don't do it, it's like it's just left alone, like an empty space. But then if you go towards it, and life is like, that was for you. That was, so we should do that as people. And then the things that doesn't make sense to us, we just leave it alone. It's not really our category of to go
Absolutely. I
into.
couldn't agree more.
Last question I will have for you is, if you had one message to all the listeners for something to take away from your research, or something you would want them to know, what might be something you would say to them?
I would say that, I think it's always worth celebrating the things that make people special and focusing on resilience. And I think, we've seen that in the populations that I've worked with where they just have these extraordinary abilities, and the abilities are linked to these extraordinary changes that have happened because of generations and generations of their ancestors doing extraordinary things. And I think, just celebrating resilience in all aspects of our life, but also in medical research is really important.
I have to follow up on that one, because it just reminded me. I forgot to mention that resilience, when I was young, that was one of the three words I would use to describe myself, or resilient. So it's in the same category that you look at. But I think it's a big deal. It's kind of in the same category as anti-fragile, sort of. And then having the ability to respond to the world as it is, and not, if something is too structured, the actual world, the tree will be blown away by the wind, because even if it's so fortified, but it doesn't have the ability to handle all the wind and whatnot, it's not really fortified in terms of time and over the years. So that's a big deal. So I'm glad you brought that up. Dr. Melissa Ilardo, I would like to thank you for coming on this episode, providing a bit of knowledge in the category of your research and sharing that with the listeners.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Glad to. And we are out.